Alrighty, let's go ahead and kick things off. So for today's topic, what we want to go through is talking about proactive maintenance. And when I say proactive maintenance, in this case, I'm specifically talking about proactive maintenance post-technical file services. So if some of you were on our webinar last week, we went through some of those options to perform certain services on our QuickBooks files, like file repairs and file condenses. So what we want to talk about today is, once we've gone through and we've done that work, what are the things we need to do to help maintain that file and make sure that file stays healthy and clean so that it's operating at its fullest capacity. So some topics that we want to go through and cover today, again, are going to be, how do we maintain our files after we go through and perform those technical services? So when we talk about doing a file repair, how do we keep that file and that system healthy once we've repaired the file and the database and that system is stable? We want to ensure that the integrity of the data is there and that the information we're getting from the QuickBooks file is reliable. We also want to look at ways to track our file size and growth post-condense. So what that means is, the purpose of a file condense is ultimately to shrink the current file size, remove historical data, as well as some possible unwanted data or information that's no longer used or needed. So once that information is removed, how do we make sure we are growing in a way that allows us to stay in QuickBooks and maintain stability without overloading the system and causing performance issues? So the first thing we want to talk about is file health. And I know the idea of the word health might sound a little funny when we're talking about our QuickBooks file or our financial software, but what I mean when I say health is, we want that file to be functioning at its peak, both from a database standpoint as well as a financial standpoint. So we want the entirety of that software to be utilized in an efficient way to give you guys the right financial information you need to make your best business decisions. So one of the first things we always recommend is going to be running verifies and rebuilds of the QuickBooks file. If I come in here to our sample QuickBooks file, and I come up here to our File tab, and then down to our Utilities section, this is where you will find some of those in-product tools that you can use on the file. Right down here, we've got our verify data as well as rebuild data options. We always recommend running a verify first, because that's going to give you an overall diagnosis of any errors that the QuickBooks software is seeing, and that's going to act as a base for you to know what needs to be resolved when we run that rebuild. So we always want to start with a verify, and that way after we've done a rebuild, we're able to come back and verify again and do a comparison to see how much was resolved with that rebuild process. Another place that you can check to see the last time a verify or rebuild was done is with the F2 product information window. If I hit this F2 screen and it brings up my product information window here, you can see there's an option that says review, last verify, and rebuild. This is a great area to see when the last time that this was done, to give you an idea of how much information could have been added to the file, to let you know how much more the file is going to have to be reviewed before we get those verify results. We recommend doing those verify and rebuild utilities on a monthly basis. That allows you to make sure that you're keeping a routine check on the QuickBooks file and keeping an eye on any possible growing issues that could be happening behind the scenes of the software. In addition to running verifies and rebuilds, one of the other things we regularly recommend checking is what are called DB file fragments. So again, a lot of information is going to come from this F2 screen. If I come back to our sample QuickBooks file and I hit my F2 key on my keyboard to bring up my product information window, one of the things you'll see here on the left-hand side says DB file fragments. Right now, my count for that is at 124. What DB file fragments are is essentially what it sounds like. It's disk fragmentation that happens due to the size of the QuickBooks file. So most often we see these file fragments created when there is too much information in the file and your Windows system or your drive can't accommodate all of that information. So it has to break things up into smaller pieces in order to be able to maintain and read that information. So most often, the larger a QuickBooks file is, the larger we will see this number grow to. So this is an area that we like to keep a regular check on as well. It's not necessarily an indicator of corruption. So again, when we're talking about going through and doing that repair process on a QuickBooks file, if we see this number growing, that doesn't mean that we have damage or corruption that is still present, but it could possibly be an issue with the file size or the space of our hard drive that QuickBooks is stored on that we want to respond to. Most often, we try to recommend getting this number to around 10. So right now we see this number is at 124. So that lets me know that my file size is possibly large and or the space that I'm asking my hard drive to use for my file is not enough. So if this is the case where we see this number growing and or it's above a quantity of 10, we would want to look at doing some portable round tripping to help reduce this DB file fragment count. In addition to regularly running verifies and rebuilds, as well as checking the DB file fragments, another thing that we recommend doing is regularly backing up a company file. A lot of times, if you are using any kind of hosting provider, they will work to do a regular backup. This most often runs overnight so that it's not interrupting you during your daily work, but that is something that can be extremely helpful if we do run into any issues in the future. So what that backup helps to do is ensure that we are creating an option if something happens to our software, our server crashes, the file becomes corrupt again. Having those backup copies that we can refer to gives us security to know that we have those files available if we need them. The backups can also be a great means for reference if something happens to our current QuickBooks file. Sometimes I've seen things happen with clients' files where the customer or vendor information will be deleted, for example. But if we have those copies of our backups from previous periods, that could have that missing information that we need to reference to get it back in our file. So these backups are a huge way to make sure that we're keeping all of our data stored and safe, and we have that information to refer back to if we were to run into any issues and something is wrong with our QuickBooks file. So always making sure we are backing up. Again, to do that backup of our QuickBooks file, if we come in here and I go ahead back to our file tab, a lot of things are going to bring us back to this file tab when we're talking about maintenance of the QuickBooks file. But I can come in here to file and then backup company, and I can choose to create a local backup. So what that means is the desktop or server that your file is saved on, this is where that backup would be created. And then you would work through the prompts to save that copy of the file. Another thing that we like to look at whenever we are focusing on file health after we've gone through a repair process is making sure that the software is updated. So just like you go through updates with your smartphone or other softwares that you're using, QuickBooks puts out updates for the software as well when it wants to work through any kind of bug or issue that could be happening in the software. It puts out a release to create a solution for that issue. Sometimes if we have our team all using different versions of QuickBooks with different versions of releases that they're on, that can cause issues with the QuickBooks file as well, because so many people have different versions of QuickBooks that they're trying to access a single file in. So making sure we are keeping that software up to date to ensure we have access to the newest corrections for the software and everyone on the team is doing that update is a huge thing to ensure that we have consistency with our QuickBooks software. So again, just to reiterate, some of the basic things we can do to maintain our file health are regularly running verifies and rebuilds, checking our DB file fragments to see if that number is growing, regularly backing up our company file, and then making sure we're updating our software, and not only we as an individual are doing it, but our team is doing it as well. So everyone across the board in your organization using QuickBooks is all functioning on that same copy. The next thing we want to talk about is file size. So this is going to relate to performing that condense on a QuickBooks file to reduce the file size. How do we make sure that we are not running into issues again where that file size is too large and we have to do a condense or possibly start a new file? So ultimately, we want to make sure that when we've reduced that file, we're maintaining the database and not overloading it too much to where we could have issues using the file or the software. One of the big things that we recommend doing is what's called a database review. And what that specifically looks at is certain areas of the QuickBooks file, like your lists. Those lists are going to be things like accounts on your chart of accounts, customers, vendors, items, all of those lists. It also looks at things like links. And when I say a link, that's going to be a connection between two transactions. So for example, if an invoice has a payment, there is a link between those two transactions because that payment is connected to the invoice in order to apply that payment balance. So in addition to looking at list data, we like to look at our links, how many connected transactions we have in the system. We also like to look at what's called targets. Targets in QuickBooks are going to be the line item detail. So for example, if I come in here to my QuickBooks software and I come to create an invoice, I can choose this back arrow and look at a previous invoice, and you can see I've got one line item for installation labor. This particular invoice has one target. So targets are the line item detail on transactions. If I had an item for labor and maybe an item for materials, that would be two targets. So targets are looking at the detail of your transactions. We can also look at what's called the TLG file. What this is it's a file that records the changes that are happening in your QuickBooks file. Whenever you make any adjustments, you add, edit, or modify data, this TLG file tracks that information, almost similar to the audit trail or audit log, but that is an area that we like to keep track of as well, because we don't want to see that larger than the file size itself. The last area that we look at when performing a database review is non-posting transactions. That's going to be our estimates, sales orders, and purchase orders. The non-posting transactions are, again, an excellent way to reduce file size because they do not have a financial impact on the QuickBooks file. So if we have old sales orders or purchase orders in the system that are not currently closed but are no longer going to be fulfilled, that's a great way to get rid of data that is not valid or useful and can help create additional file space. So these are the main areas whenever we are talking about doing a database review that we look at. When we perform the database review, what we try to do is take two files that are 6 months apart and do a review of the files in each of these areas to provide a comparison. And what that tells us is if we say, for example, we did a database review on a file today, and then we did it again sometime in November or December, 6 months out, and we can look at what areas the file has increased or decreased in. And with that information, we can perform an estimate of the likely file size growth up to 2 years out. And that information is so crucial and helpful in making sure that we have an understanding of what our likely pathway forward is with our QuickBooks file when it comes to performance and stability. Again, we want to keep that file size around 1 to 1.5 gigabytes. So if our starting file size, for example, is 0.5 gigabyte, and in 2 years, that database review tells us we're going to be at 2 gigabytes, that growth is very exciting, but that would tell us that we would be pushing the limits of the QuickBooks file because we would be beyond that recommended threshold. So the database review allows us to compare two files, the same file, just at 2 different points in time to try to help us understand where our likely growth is. For example, I can think of one client in particular. When we performed a Condense for them, they originally started out at about 4 gigabytes, so that was a little beyond the recommended threshold of QuickBooks. We ended up getting their file size down to about 0.3 gigabytes. We removed most of the data from their file, so that was a huge breakthrough to get their file size that small with what we started out at. But because of the volume of data they were adding to the QuickBooks file on a daily basis, that database review revealed that we were going to be pushing about 1.5 gigabytes by the time we were at that 2-year mark. So this is also an opportunity, if that's something that we see in those database review results. This allows us to say, is QuickBooks possibly the right solution, or can we maybe look at that ERP space like we had talked about at the start of the call with those alternative options like Acumatica, NetSuite, and Xero? Or it allows us to also create the opportunity to say, I understand my file is going to be growing. Let's look at options that we can do on a more regular basis to keep that file size nice and slim. So both of those options are there, and that's extremely helpful information that the database review provides in order to help make sure that we are keeping our file healthy and we're not having to go back and respond to things like corruption or damage because we're overloading the system. Okay. Let me go ahead and see if we've got any questions filtering through. We've got just a couple minutes here, but I'm going to go ahead and see if we've got any questions in here showing currently. I don't see any questions as of right now, but again, if you guys go back and look at anything internally with your file, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We always want to make sure that we are keeping our QuickBooks file healthy and we're utilizing the system as much as possible to get what we need from an operational and a financial standpoint. So again, to reiterate, when we go through and we do those things like a file repair or a file condense, we always want to make sure that we have measures in place to maintain that file and keep the file operating. Thank you guys so much for the time this afternoon. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you've got any questions. We've also got our YouTube channel online as well that has some great information regarding QuickBooks and the features and availability of the software. So that's a great avenue to check out as well if you guys have questions about the software.